substantial. This, along with the feasibility of enforcement, indicates that enforcement would be a valuable approach. Similar considerations apply to policies limiting travel. Subpoint B, quarantine measures which limit freedom of movement are necessary during public health emergencies. According to the CDC, quarantine is used to separate one who may have been exposed to a disease and may develop illness away from other people. Quarantine policies were crucial in preventing the spread of SARS during the 2003 outbreak, Bell 04. Isolating patients combined with identifications and management of contacts was highly effective in interrupting transmission in several countries. For example, a study in Singapore demonstrated a correlation between isolating patients after onset of symptoms and a decreased number of secondary cases among their contacts. In the SARS epidemic, persons under quarantine were confined at home and actively monitored for symptoms. Quarantine was legally mandated and monitored. South Korea, a country that only had 1,500 COVID deaths a year after the first case was reported, utilized a very effective quarantine policy, Kim 21. People who have been in contact with a confirmed case, traveled internationally, or suspect that they might have been infected are required to self-quarantine. Those in quarantine are required to use the Self-Quarantine Safety Protection app for 14 days. Case officers monitor the app to identify when people break quarantine. At the same time, case officers provide support to make quarantine easier. Twice daily, they check in with those who are quarantining to deliver food, toiletries, and offer psychological counseling. Because quarantine policies are necessary to mitigate the spread of the virus and save lives, they are certainly justified. Subpoint C, community-wide containment measures like lockdowns, enforced social distancing, and travel restrictions are crucial to manage a public health emergency. These policies have proven to be the most effective way to stop the spread of COVID, Bo 20. This comprehensive ecological study covering 190 countries indicated that the implementation of distancing was significantly associated with a decrease in transmission of COVID-19. All non-pharmaceutical interventions implementations involving distancing were associated with greater decrease in transmission rates. Another study indicated that lockdowns and social distancing reduced the growth rate of confirmed cases in 5 countries by 52.37% on average. Countries that pursued an elimination as opposed to a mitigation strategy during COVID utilized many policies that limited movement and were overwhelmingly successful, Baker 20. Investment in 3 categories of public health infrastructure is needed to achieve elimination: border management, case-based control measures, notably testing, case isolation, contact tracing, and quarantine, and population-based interventions such as physical distancing and mask use. Obvious benefits of rapid elimination are greatly reduced case numbers, a lower risk of health sector overload, and fewer overall deaths of COVID-19. There's also an opportunity to avoid serious health inequalities. Countries following an elimination strategy, notably China, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, have had markedly lower COVID-19 mortality than those in Europe and North America pursuing mitigation. The effect on GDP based on IMF projections for all of 2020 was more favorable for countries with elimination goals. In Europe, lockdowns saved millions of lives, Gallagher 20. The team at Imperial College London assessed the impact of restrictions in 11 European countries. The researchers used disease modeling to predict how many deaths there would have been if lockdowns had not happened. They estimated 3.2 million people would have died by May 4th, 2020, if not for measures such as closing businesses and telling people to stay home. In addition to saving lives, these policies reduce the amount of time a public health emergency lasts and its prolonged effects, Lundberg 21. The benefits in the US from social distancing outweigh the cost to GDP by roughly $5.2 trillion. Preserving economic health has been used as a justification to refrain from mandatory public health policies. Both Sweden and Massachusetts adopted voluntary shelter-in-place measures, yet experienced far greater losses, especially in Massachusetts among minority populations, and greater losses to GDP. Mandatory enforcement is a critical contributor to decreased mortality and attenuated economic impact of the epidemic. Limits on freedom of movement and assembly are crucial for saving lives and ending public health emergencies. Because they produce these significant positive consequences, they are absolutely justified. Thus, I stand in firm affirmation and I'm open for cross.
All right, can everyone hear me all right? Time starts now. Your criterion is consequentialism, correct?
Yes.
How do you evaluate a time frame for consequentialism?
So the time frame is a public health emergency, as specified by the resolution.
All right, I'm asking what's the time frame to act?
To act is during the public health emergency. So when you meet the standards that the WHO defines as a public health emergency, that's the time in which we're discussing in today's debate.
All right, so we're just evaluating the consequences within consequentialism, but there is no time to implement the policy itself, is what you're articulating.
Well, let me explain it a little bit more clearly. What I'm saying is, like, within a public health emergency is when we have to use consequentialism to decide what kind of policies are going to produce positive consequences and save lives and not extend the epidemic even longer than it's already lasted. But then also we see that these consequences that are being created by the policies that I'm advocating for are huge long-term impacts, like saving lives. Like if you don't do that, those people are never coming back, right? And then also like limiting the amount of time that the public health emergency lasts too has a huge impact as well. So we need to look at what measures are going to most effectively end it quickly.
Okay, people are generally fearful of pandemics, right?
Yes, they are. But also, like, if you're trying to argue that like people would follow mandates that weren't like mandatory and just like voluntary policies, they wouldn't, because by evidence demonstrates that when a mandate was put into place, then compliance became so much greater, and that was what saved lives.
All right, but when people are scared of pandemics, they just generally turn to isolate, right?
No, they don't. That's not been proven by certain examples. For instance, Sweden, they had voluntary policies for the most part, and a lot more people died. They had much greater rates of death compared to their neighbors.
Let's actually talk
and
about
greater economic impact.
Didn't Sweden flatten the line of COVID-19 in 2021?
Did they what?
Didn't they flatten the line of COVID-19 in 2021?
No, they did not flatten the line. I mean, we have vaccines now, which helps to end a public health emergency, right? But COVID had a disproportionate impact on Sweden because they didn't implement the policies that I'm advocating for. And so I can read very recent evidence about that as well. Like from April of 2021, according to Clayson, Sweden has one of the highest infection rates in Western Europe, with 606 new infections per million per day, while its neighbors Denmark, Finland, Norway have 115, 62, and 112. So no, it's not like doing better during 2021.
All right. On your sub point B, you talk about quarantine, correct?
Yes, I do.
All right. Why won't voluntary quarantine work?
Voluntary quarantine wouldn't work because people would leave their homes and it's not enforced like mandatory quarantines are. And then also based off of the evidence I provided of like specific examples.
Quarantines enforced.
When?
How are mandatory quarantines enforced?
Okay, sure. So you can look to the examples that I provided. So for instance, in the Bello Card, I talked about how they were enforced during the SARS epidemic, where they were confined at home and they were monitored for symptoms. And then it was legally mandated and monitored by government officials. And then for Kim at 21, it was case officers monitoring people's location to make sure that they weren't breaking quarantine. So that's how it was enforced in those specific instances.
I'll be taking prep. All right, I took 225. It's going to be the negative case, and then I'm going to refute my opponents. Is everyone ready? All right, sounds good. Time starts now. I negate the resolution resolved. A public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. I agree with my opponent's definitions, but I value equality. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention explained in 2008 that equality, as understood in public health literature and practice, is when everyone has the opportunity to attain their full health potential and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of the social position. My criterion is structural violence, which occurs whenever people are disadvantaged by political, legal, economic, or cultural traditions. Contention 1 is discrimination. Subpoint A is based on race. Lockdowns have disproportionately hurt people of color. Costa in 20 explains that nearly half of Black small businesses have been wiped out. Black businesses experienced the most acute decline with a 41% drop, Latinx business owners fell by 32%, and Asian business owners dropped by 26%. Perry et al. In 20 furthers that Black adults are over 3 times as likely as whites to report food insecurity, being laid off, or being unemployed. Together, the results support that pandemic precarity disproportionately affects historically disadvantaged groups, widening inequality. Subpoint B is discrimination based on class. Palomino et al. In 20 explains that in Europe, the burden of the pandemic will be disproportionately borne by low-wage earners, which will significantly increase poverty and inequality. Because not all workers are able to perform their job at home, and some activities are closed, there will be potential wage losses for a significant part of the labor force that cannot fully work during the lockdown. Firstly, there is a 10% mean loss rate for poor workers. Secondly, the proportion of poor workers increases significantly for all European nations. Minority wealth was increasing prior to the pandemic. However, because lockdown measures don't have an equal impact across race and class, advocating for punitive measures will only exacerbate structural violence. Contention 2 is democracy. Rapucci and Spilovitz in 20 find the pandemic has weakened democracy in 80 nations. Since the outbreak began, governments in 80 countries have responded by engaging in abuses of power, often undermining the very systems of accountability needed to protect public health. Alizada et al. In 21 explains that it's not just autocracies that are repressing liberties, violations also occurred in electoral democracies, most notably in Sri Lanka and El Salvador. The Sri Lankan government used the pandemic to impose new restrictions on the media, intimidate and silence critics, and repress civil society organizations. Likewise, in El Salvador, the government detained hundreds of people for violating lockdown regulations and held them in unsanitary conditions, all while ignoring injunctions by the country's Supreme Court to protect fundamental rights. Ultimately, numerous governments around the world have taken the pandemic as an excuse to demolish democratic spaces and systematically repress civil liberties, impacts that will last far beyond that of the pandemic. Moving on to the affirmative case. Firstly, on their value of justice, you can't have justice without a baseline level of equality, aka enhancing the common good in the affirmative world will lead to an application of justice that is just generally leads to more discrimination, suggesting that the negative framework of equality is a prerequisite to their framework. Next on this thesis of consequentialism. Firstly, the Department of Health and Human Services finds that a consequentialist perspective doesn't give equitable access to resources for those who are disabled, etc. You wouldn't give a ventilator to those who are about to die under a utilitarian or a consequentialist mindset. Moreover, recall that in cross-examination, she isn't able to give you a time frame to evaluate the consequences. This is really important because time is of dire need in the middle of a pandemic. Moreover, finally, even if we just weigh the consequences, the affirmative narrative doesn't work. Cross-apply the analysis about how lockdowns disproportionately hurt minority communities and lead to authoritarian backsliding. Now, on our first contention, specifically on mask mandates aren't restrictions on civil liberties. In Jacobson v. Massachusetts, the court ruled that the imposition of mask mandates doesn't violate civil liberties, as there are restrictions where an individual can subject themselves to the common good. Secondly, you can of course have things like clothing restrictions, which is why we have things like public indecency laws. Moving on to subpoint B, she basically just tells you about quarantine. However, the example that she gives is South Korea. This is really problematic because as Scott in 20 goes on to articulate, South Korea has massive privacy violations that are disproportionate to the situation, aka South Korea collects data based on your race, gender, ethnicity, class, which is not needed for effective epidemiology or needed for effective quarantine, aka South Korea is using a response that isn't needed. Moreover, you could have a decentralized database and still the policy would work. That's what Summers et al. In 20 goes on to articulate to you, as New Zealand has a decentralized database that uses non-identifiable information, and they're still able to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Next, they tell you about lockdowns on subpoint C. A couple of responses here. Firstly, the effectiveness of lockdowns tends to come less from lockdown and more from voluntary social distancing. The higher the case incidence was, the lower the mobility rate was in numerous nations like Brazil, Sweden, Italy, South Africa, the UK, and the US. This is Malone and Yatskin in 20. Essentially, since people social distance before mandatory measures were imposed, the effectiveness of lockdowns comes from voluntary compliance. Secondly, overtly coercive measures can undermine the trust that people have in public health and government responses, aka undermining the effectiveness of the response. A key example is the United Kingdom, where citizens started social distancing less during the second wave as the first lockdown was excessive and disproportionate. This led to over 50,000 additional COVID-19 deaths during the second wave that could have been mitigated with proper social distancing. Thirdly, you don't need lockdowns if nations prepare for pandemics before they come. I have two key examples of this. Firstly, Oppenheim et al. In 19 find that during the H1N1 epidemic, countries with good pandemic preparedness had to impose less lockdowns and did better in responding. And secondly, high amounts of testing are preferable to lockdowns. That's a narrative you see in places like Slovakia, where they actually mass tested instead of imposing lockdowns. That's McKee in 20. Moreover, the imposition of lockdowns just tends to lead to more repression, aka this is why India got reclassified from electoral democracy to an electoral autocracy in 2020. Next, they give you the specific examples of China and Taiwan. This is really problematic because in both of these countries, the government is using disproportionate responses, aka the government is collecting information that just isn't necessary. That's a narrative you see in places like China, especially as the government is color coding its people. So if you have like COVID-19, you're given a red color, yet if you don't, you're given green. This is really problematic, however, because there are multiple instances where people don't have COVID-19 and they're given the red marking, aka the Chinese response is just mass surveillance that is disproportionate to the situation. They talk about Europe, but cross-applied my analysis from the United Kingdom, which shows that you saw 50,000 additional COVID-19 deaths. They tell you about Sweden. However, Sweden didn't do much of anything, aka the government didn't encourage anybody to social distance or wear a mask. Yet in the long term, when they started doing this, they were actually able to mitigate the spread. They tell you about economic health, yet cross-apply my first contention, which articulates how the imposition of lockdowns disproportionately hurts minority communities in the long run. Ultimately, the solution to the affirmative solvency should never lead to more systemic oppression, which it does, as my second contention goes on to articulate.
Okay, are you ready for cross?
Yeah.
Okay, then we can begin our time now. So is the fact that minority groups are disproportionately affected by public health emergencies also a form of structural violence?
You'd have to explain.
I have to explain?
I mean, like what part of the public health emergency is what I'm trying to articulate?
The public health emergency itself disproportionately affecting minority populations. Is that not a form of structural violence?
Sure, but you don't need punitive measures to reduce deaths, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, we can talk about that more in a second. But in regards to the point about discrimination and the effect that lockdowns can have, in countries that implemented restrictive measures like closing their borders or having quarantine policies that were mandatory, weren't they able to avoid having as many lockdowns as countries that didn't implement those other measures as soon?
Well, firstly, if you're talking about closing your borders, travel bans aren't violations of civil liberties. And this is largely because governments only have obligations to their own people. So if New Zealand stopped a Chinese citizen from coming into New Zealand, that wouldn't be a violation of civil liberties. But if New Zealand stopped a New Zealand citizen from coming into New Zealand, that would be a violation of civil liberties.
Okay, but that is what countries did, is that they closed the borders.
Essentially, it's not a violation of civil liberties.
Okay, I mean, I disagree with that, but I can respond to that later. In your point about democracies, like repressing free speech, were they doing that to solve the public health emergency?
No.
Okay, so then why is the public health emergency what justified it?
Well, basically, what you see in 2020 is that a lot of countries have used the pandemic as an excuse to systematically like repress free speech, etc. So they're using it as an excuse. They're using it as an excuse.
As an excuse, but it's not actually justified by it, right?
Well, obviously, the restrictions on free speech are never justified generally.
Okay.
That's what you meant.
Okay. And so then talking about this like voluntary policies, do you have any examples of countries that did that and were more effective?
Well, South Korea violated civil liberties in other ways, yet they also had voluntary lockdowns. Japan also had voluntary lockdowns.
Okay. And so in regards to South Korea, on the neg side, you're saying they couldn't have limited civil liberties at all, correct? So
okay, I'm saying that South Korea didn't have to get like data, data based on like race, gender, ethnicity, class for effective technology. And
the getting unnecessary data, again, that was not because of a public health emergency, right? Because it was unnecessary in solving the public health emergency. Is that true?
Well, the idea that I'm trying to articulate is that if a government collects information based on my gender or ethnicity, that kind of information isn't necessary for effective epidemiology.
Yeah, agreed. And so do you have any other examples of countries that pursued a voluntary approach?
Well, New Zealand used a decentralized database when it came to contact tracing.
How is that not still like limiting civil liberties?
Because they're using non-identifiable information.
Okay. All right. So I am going to use running prep time starting now. Okay, I'm going to stop prep time now. That was 3 minutes and 26 seconds of prep use. Just going to write that down. All right, is everybody ready? Okay. Then I will begin my time now. Okay, so starting off on the next side of a flow, my opponent has a value of equality. First of all, I'm going to achieve this more on the app because we're protecting the common good and making sure that people in general, their health is protected, and that in countries that implement the policies that I've advocated for, the pandemics have ended sooner. And then also justice is going to be better because you need to make sure that you're like giving people like adequate support and protecting their right to life and also their livelihoods. Whereas equality could just mean that everybody is in an equally bad situation, which is exactly what happens when you don't implement effective public health policies. Now, looking at the criterion of structural violence, first of all, I'm going to achieve this better because these public health emergencies have a disproportionate effect on minorities. We see that in my Baker card, I demonstrated how by having these elimination methods that require limiting civil liberties, countries like Australia and New Zealand were able to mitigate the effects, the disproportionate effects on minorities within their countries. And also, according to TIE in 21, the mortality rate of COVID-19 among among African Americans is more than twofold higher than whites. So by solving a public health emergency, by saving as many lives as possible, and by preventing the public health emergency for lasting for so long, you're saving the lives of people in marginalized communities the most. And then looking at this first point about discrimination, my opponent talks about race-based discrimination, how Black businesses were closed, and that leads to more unemployment. My important point here is that by limiting civil liberties, like closing borders, which definitely does limit people's ability to move around, and by implementing quarantine policies, which definitely limit people's freedom of movement, you can avoid having to implement more stringent measures like lockdowns, which is exactly what South Korea did. They didn't have to have many mandatory lockdowns, although they did have certain ones in certain places when there were outbreaks. But the reason why they were able to do that is because they limited civil liberties in other respects and managed to control the public health emergency more so that they didn't have to use this last approach, which is a lockdown. And ultimately, if a country gets in a really bad situation, a lockdown becomes their only option. But if you do it the next thing and never limit civil liberties, you put yourself in this bad situation. You increase the economic impact on people. And that's true according to different sources saying that the economic impact is going to be increased if you don't actually solve for the public health emergency, which is also demonstrated within my first and second contentions. And then looking at this class argument, again, it's the exact same arguments that you can avoid these effects by actually effectively managing the public health emergency. And then that's according to Connolly in 21. It says not locking down and letting the virus spread without restriction also harms the economy, the IMF found. And then my opponent is encouraging like voluntary obligations. And this is saying people may choose to practice physical distancing to avoid being infected, which also harms the economy. So my opponent is advocating for the same thing, it's the same behavioral change that would cause harm to the economy. But ultimately, we just need to have the most effective measures in order to prevent that economic harm. And then in regards to this democracy point, first of all, this is not unique because countries are going to abuse people's rights no matter what. My opponent does not solve for this in any way. It still exists. However, if you vote neg, you still have a lot of structural violence in that status quo. But what you don't have is the life-saving capabilities of these policies that I'm advocating for. And then in regards to these countries are repressing free speech, my opponent conceded that they're not actually doing it because of a public health emergency. They're doing it because they want to abuse their power over their citizens. It's not being justified by a public health emergency that my opponent agreed to my definition of. So that's going to be a major point in today's round. Now, moving on to the ass side of a flow, my opponent said that mask mandates aren't limitations, but first of all, the Belgian government justifies it as being limitations on movement because it limits where you can go if you're not wearing a mask. Also, people say autonomy, people say expression. Ultimately, people are going to believe it's going to limit their civil liberties, so you have to mandate it, and I've demonstrated that that is the most effective way of doing it. But ultimately, I have even more impacts accessed by my subpoint B and C. And then in regards to quarantine, my opponent says South Korea is problematic because they had privacy violations and unnecessary data collection. I agree it was unnecessary. That's very clear to me that they weren't actually doing it because of a public health emergency. What they did do in regards to the public health emergency was having this effective quarantine policy that saved many lives. And my opponent drops the bell card talking about how this was crucial in SARS. And then in regards to subpoint C, my opponent says that there was a decentralized approach in New Zealand. Again, this was still limiting people's privacy. And this is a perfect example of how you can do it in a moral way. And then looking at my opponent's other text, she says that this comes from less lockdowns and more social distancing, but there's no real examples of countries actually doing that and being effective. Clearly, all of my methods are showing that the most effective countries were ones that limited civil liberties and did it soon so that they could stop this massive impact from happening on other people within their country and also saving many, many lives.
All right, I'll be taking prep. right, it's just going to be the affirmative, the negative, and then some voters. Is everyone ready? All right, time starts now. Firstly, on their value of justice, they basically just talk about adequate supports. What does this even mean? Essentially, in order to have proper access to justice, you need equitable access to justice, aka the negative framework of equality is always going to be a prerequisite to their framework. Then they go on to drop all the responses that I give on their criterion of consequentialism. This is really important because it means that we can't use the value criterion of consequentialism to weigh the round. Moreover, there is no actual time frame to evaluate consequentialism in the middle of a pandemic, largely because pandemics are really like time hesitant, and you need to have a proper time frame. On mask mandates, they tell you that it's a violation of civil liberties, yet in Jacobson v. Massachusetts, the court ruled that mandates aren't violations of civil liberties. On South Korea, she literally agrees that the data collection was unnecessary. This is really important because it goes to show how the imposition of civil liberties that causes unnecessary data collection leads to a disproportionate response in the long run, aka South Korea could have mitigated COVID-19 without using unnecessary data collection, without the violation of civil liberties. That's her own concession. Moreover, that's exactly the narrative you see in places like New Zealand. New Zealand didn't violate civil liberties and use non-identifiable data that was anonymous that people consented to give. That's really important because New Zealand was able to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 all while not using identifiable information. On voluntary lockdowns, her only response is that I have no example. Yet Malone and Yatkin in 20 specifically articulate that in numerous countries, whether it's Japan, Brazil, South Africa, the US, the UK, etc., people started social distancing before lockdowns were imposed. This is really important. That's the analysis that she missed in her last speech. Essentially, the effectiveness of lockdowns comes from voluntary compliance. She also goes on to drop the trust argument. Once again, this is really important because it shows how overtly coercive measures undermine the trust that people have in government responses, which end up undermining the government response. AKA, this is the reason why you saw 50,000 additional COVID-19 deaths in the United Kingdom that could have been mitigated with proper social distancing. Then she goes on to concede this argument of pandemic preparedness. Once again, this is also really important because the entirety of the H1N1 epidemic was mitigated without the imposition of civil liberties. AKA, when countries are prepared for pandemics, they don't have to use punitive measures. This is also a narrative that you saw in places like Slovakia, where they actually mass tested in order to mitigate COVID-19 instead of the imposition of lockdowns. Next, she also goes on to drop the argument of China. Once again, the entire situation in China is really disproportionate, aka the government is collecting information and surveilling the entire population, a response that leads to more repression of liberties in the long run. Then she also goes on to drop India. Once again, this is really important because having the world's biggest democracy reclassify into autocracy clearly shows that punitive measures are leading to far worse outcomes. Then she goes on to drop the argument that the reason Sweden failed was largely because they didn't encourage any kind of social distancing or mask wearing, aka when the government started doing this in November of 2020, they were actually able to mitigate the spread in the long run. Now, finally, on the negative case, they tell you that they achieve equality more on the affirmative, yet they go on to concede the argument that minorities are dying more in the status quo, aka you have lockdowns all around the United States, yet they're not working to mitigate the impact of minority deaths. Their own solvency isn't working. On structural violence, they just once again tell you about the disproportionate impact of minorities, cross-apply the analysis that I just gave you, but moreover, punitive measures increase the impact that you have on minority communities. That's what my first contention goes on to articulate to you. Now, on the first contention, she basically just articulates to you that you need to deal with the pandemic before you deal with the economy. However, she goes on to concede the argument that the effectiveness of mandatory lockdowns comes from voluntary compliance because people social distance before the imposition of lockdowns. And secondly, you can use things like pandemic preparedness in order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and other diseases. The entirety of H1N1 was mitigated without the imposition of restrictive measures. Moreover, you can extend the public trust argument. Once again, this is really important because minorities just don't tend to have high trust in government, aka people don't social distance when you have things like lockdowns. Once again, this is what allowed 50,000 additional COVID-19 deaths in the United Kingdom. On democracy, her only response is that it's generally just non-unique. However, in no other year but 2020 have you seen such dramatic democratic decline that is in 80 countries. Moreover, it's not just autocratic countries that are declining, it's electoral democracies as well. That's the narrative you see in places like Sri Lanka and El Salvador that are democracies that have declined into autocracies in 2020. But it's not just small countries that are declining, it's bigger ones as well, aka India, the world's biggest democracy, home to nearly 1.4 billion people, declining into one of the world's biggest autocracies is clearly a big deal. In the long run, what this leads to is far more government corruption, far less government democratic elections, and far more repression against the country's Muslim minority. Then she tells you that it's not justified with the public health emergency, yet Rapucci and Spilowitz in 20 articulate that a lot of the actions these governments are taking is because they're using the public health emergency balance as an excuse. Now, finally, on voter issues, the first is going to be this thesis of minorities. The slide of authoritarianism comes prior to solving individual pandemics, as not only will there be more repression, but the long-term capability to respond to public health emergencies goes down because people don't trust authoritarian governments. Moreover, you're seeing electoral democracies decline into autocracies in 2020 because of punitive measures. That's the narrative you see in Sri Lanka, El Salvador, India, etc. Now, the second key voter issue is this thesis of minority communities. The pandemic has made it far worse for minority individuals. Minority wealth and opportunities were increasing prior to the pandemic before lockdowns had systematically destroyed that progress. Now, the final voter issue is this thesis of trust. In their next speech, they're going to collapse the argument that lockdowns are necessary and they work, etc. But they go on to concede that in the United Kingdom, the reason why you saw 50,000 additional COVID-19 deaths is because people trust the government less. aka the affirmative solvency should just generally not lead to more oppression.
Okay, I'm going to use my remaining prep. Sorry, I'm just thinking. Okay, I believe I have like 2 minutes, 15 seconds of prep time remaining. Is that correct? Okay, then I'm going to use that now. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, then I'm going to begin my time now. My first major voting issue is that my opponent is not achieving their own framework. First of all, in order to mitigate the effects of a public health emergency, you have to use the most effective policies in ending it. My opponent tells you that voluntary policies would work just as well, but gives no good examples of that happening during COVID, and never answers to the fact that the countries that responded most effectively to COVID were the ones that had the most restrictive measures. There's never any answer to that. So ultimately, we see that in order to protect minorities who are disproportionately affected by public health emergencies, you have to end the public health emergency. You have to prevent people from dying. And I've demonstrated in this debate that the measures that I advocate for do it more effectively than anything my opponent does. And even if there were some sort of effectiveness to voluntary policies, that's way too big of a risk to just say, oh, we're just going to do voluntary. And then that could result in many, many people dying. We see that when we just had guidelines, they didn't work. The mandates were what changed things. And that's what I demonstrate within my case, which has been largely undercovered by my opponent, but I'll go onto that more in a second. Ultimately, we're all looking at like consequences as to like the impacts in today's round. So consequentialism is what we should look at. And even under structural violence, that's a certain consequence that I am achieving for, because I'm making sure that we mitigate the effects of a pandemic on the economy, which would disproportionately affect lower income people, and then also minorities who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We need to end it as soon as possible, so use the most effective policies. And so my next point about that is that my opponent is not demonstrating that voluntary policies would actually work at all. First of all, there's no examples during COVID of that actually working. My opponent frequently actually talks about how New Zealand handled it well. New Zealand absolutely limited people's civil liberties. They closed borders. They had lockdowns when they needed to. They enforced social distancing, limited gathering numbers. They had quarantine policies. You don't get any of that on my opponent's side. And yet she tries to use it as an example of how they can handle it effectively. What New Zealand demonstrates is that you can limit civil liberties in a moral way, which is exactly what I needed to prove on the app. You can have these extremely effective policies and you can do them in a way that doesn't unnecessarily infringe on people's rights, which is exactly what New Zealand did. And when countries unnecessarily infringe on people's rights, it isn't because of a public health emergency. If you look at a resolution that says a public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties, they're not actually using the public health emergency to justify those actions, because my opponent and I agree they were unnecessary restrictions. But when we see that we have to have these limitations in order to have these effective policies. And then my big major voting issue 2 is going to be looking at the fact that my opponent talked about South Korea as they could have effectively handled it if they hadn't had this collection of data that was unnecessary. But what South Korea did was they had quarantine policies that I talk about within my case. They locked down their borders. They had enforced social distancing. You don't get any of that on the AF side, and also on the neg side. And the neg also isn't solving for structural oppression because it exists no matter what. It might have gotten worse, but ultimately we see that in order to minimize those impacts, we need to reduce the time that a public health emergency exists at all, which is exactly what these policies do. So looking specifically at my subpoint C, we see that countries that pursued elimination, that did these limitations on civil liberties, they were the most effective. They ended their emergencies fastest. That mitigates limits all the negative effects that we see of those policies themselves, because it's limiting the time of the public health emergency and saving millions of lives. Good debate.
Good debate.
Right. So it looks like I was the last one, huh? Dang it. Well, congratulations to both of you for making it. It's an incredible accomplishment. And I will announce that in an incredibly close round, which is fitting of a 3-2 decision, it was a 3-2 decision for the affirmative. So I think we're supposed to say who voted which way. Isn't that what Kara told us?
Yes.
Okay, so I voted F.
I was neg.
I voted F.
I voted negative.
And mathematically, because of the decision, that means I voted F.
Thank you so much for judging. And you did absolutely amazing. It was a really fun debate.